These have been some very useful sessions. 25 years ago, the first Congress was organized here in this very same uh, Congress Hall, and that's where the Educating Cities was created. We will be having a round table on the Educating City, memory and projects, to look not only at the past, but to go over and remember all of the milestones behind us, all with the view to the future and where we're heading with our cities, the challenges before us for our cities to be open and welcoming. Now, to present this roundtable, who would be better than Milagros Oliveira, who's a scientist, and she is a representative from the Autonomous University of Madrid, and she's a journalist as well. Since we are a bit behind, we're going to try to be very strict with time. I'm sorry to have to be so strict. We're going to be talking here about the past and the future, and talking, of course, about the present as well. 25 years ago, we had the first meeting of Educating Cities, and 20 years ago the organization was organized, and there have been a tremendous number of experience involved, which has led to much progress and milestones. From time to time, it is worth stopping and taking a look at where we've been and where we're going. Well, seeing where you're going is very difficult because the world is constantly changing, and particularly now. Looking, if we were at the time we're in now, if we had to describe it, it would be one of accelerated change. I think that's the best description of where we are now. It's a world of increasing complexity and of growing at a growing speed. And all processes are going more quickly, and also because we have less time to even take the time to stop and think where we want to go. That's in society and politics in every area. The word that would best describe the feelings of many citizens, even in particular young people, is uncertainty. That's a key word. Not only are we in a period of change, but we're in changing times, a change of era. That means there are thoroughgoing changes in paradigms, in education, and in the paradigm of the cities and education. So it's worth looking at how the change is taking place in cities, and now this is mainly in the cities, influences people, and how we can have an impact on that. Based on the Charter of Educating Cities and best practices and experiences, something that's already consolidated, we have to have new experiences, a new idea of educating cities that will meet the needs of the citizens who will be living in these cities, who are not the same as those who were living in these cities 20 years ago and who will have different needs. We have three fantastic speakers with a very long biography, and I can't say everything about them because I wouldn't end here. See if Mr. Firenze Alfieri. Well, who doesn't know Turin or Torino? Who doesn't know about Turin, especially if you're of a certain age? Well, much of what was done there was the result of the work of Mr. Alfieri. He's been a pedagogue. He's been responsible for education in different town councils, and he has many books to his name. That's all in his biography. Those of you who are from Barcelona and people from outside as well will know Juan Manuel del Pozo, who has been a regional minister for education here and who has worked very much on the philosophy of ethics, and he's published a book called Educationari, which is an invitation to see education through 60 different concepts. It's very interesting, and he is currently the public defender for Lleida. So this is a very important position. And finally, Angelica Satiro. Many of you may be familiar with her work done in helping teachers and in different bodies in teaching philosophy. Even kids can learn philosophy, but she in particular is somebody who's very curious and has been in a lot of projects, and she is the director of the Casa Creativa, and she promoted something called Crear Mundos, which is a network of networks, and she's very specialized in social innovation, not only in the area of education, but in all creative processes. And she mainly, in what she's known for, is bringing young people into these processes. And so she has been to big countries, small countries, big schools, small schools, all types of centers of all dimension. And so she has a very broad and cross-cutting view of this issue that we're going to deal with. Now, looking at the past first, but not without staying in the past, I would ask the first speaker, based on experiences and best practices that he himself remembers and has been involved in educating cities, which are the ones which should be kept and which are the ones which should be changed for new paradigms for educating cities?
Hanno detto che posso parlare.
I've been told I can speak Italian. Is that true? Great. Well, that makes me very happy because that makes life easier for me. I'd like to tell you perhaps something that's quite controversial. Sweetly controversial is that, in my view, we need to be very linear, very simple on this issue. We shouldn't be overcome by the temptation of complexity, because overall an idea such as the educating city risks getting lost. So during my brief intervention, I'm going to try to be very simple, very linear, starting with how the idea was established. I have to tell you quite clearly that preparing for this meeting gave me an opportunity to realize that the modernity of this idea, well, I can't share the fact that everything's changed. Something that was valid 20 years ago is no longer valid. Let's see if I can demonstrate that, because in terms of my experience, particularly the history of my city, this has been the path.
Tutto comincia, se vogliamo, molto prima di noi, alla fine dell'Ottocento.
Everything began before us, when a very famous American philosopher, John Dewey, wrote a book, a fundamental book entitled School and Society. And he said that everything that we do at school, well, he said the quality criteria of school can be found that what's done at school has an impact of what's done outside school. It's quite simple, as you can see, but very productive. And then from that idea came a story, the active school movement, the educational cooperation movement, and Dewey added that how do schools have an impact on society? Well, schools have to provide life education, and the fundamental instrument to do so is life itself. That's the strength of what that American philosopher thought. So, as I was saying, the movement of active school the active school movement, interpreted this idea in a scholastic manner and thought that if school has to prepare for life, then school has to be organized like life, but a miniature life within school. So that was the line of thinking, very important from a number of points of view. So at school, the children do theatre, they do gardening, they do sport. So school is a miniature version of society because school has to prepare children for society. So the techniques and the materials and the spaces at school need to constitute a miniature society. Then, in my experience, in 1975, in our city, a group of protagonists of this active school association, I was one of them, became the administrators of the city. And there we saw the fundamental idea, which was, why should we miniaturize cities in schools and not make the city available to the school? Obviously, this requires two things. One, the school has to use the city, it has to accept the proposal, and then the city needs to be organized in such a way that it can be used by the school. It's not as simple as the school using the city or the city becoming a big school. So our experience showed, well, the mayor, we together spoke with the city representatives. We had a very simple discourse. The fact that the school educates children for life is not of interest to the school, but also to life, to the city system, because the school can be self-referential. But what does the city do with a self-referential school? Well, that principle was very productive because a number of city components or components of the system, not only the cultural components, and that was another interesting thing, not just the libraries, the theatres, etc., but industries, services, the police forces, they all accepted this rather original idea, which was to involve all ages of children at school, to enable them to touch, to have a direct contact. And that was seen as an investment for the future, for future citizens. Another fundamental move was the fact that we observed that the direct relationship, not organized by the teacher, that is, not miniaturized, but that, that was a Spanish word, said the speaker, but that warm, direct rapport was really educational. And that had an impact on the children, on the students, and it made us think that it would be more productive, far more productive than that somewhat cold rapport between the child and the school. That doesn't mean that the school doesn't have a function, but the function of thinking needs to be done on something that's true. And so that direct relationship between the school children and real people who make the city live in all of its fields, that produce the city, if you like, well, we thought that it was invaluable. The next step was this. We said, well, if the relationship between no longer the children, but also the citizens and the city, that direct relationship, not governed, not miniaturized, if it's so productive, well, perhaps the problem isn't the city being at the service of the school, but the problem is the city being at the service of the citizens. And this is the substance. It needs to think about helping citizens throughout their entire existence to understand, first and foremost, their environment, that is the city, but also the world. It's clear that this idea that led to the definition of the educating city is far more complex and delicate than the idea of making the various city resources available to the school. It's far more wide-reaching, but it's also far more important. So, the work carried out by the city and the school in Turin continues. I'm sure that's not only the case for Turin. I'm sure it's the case for a number of cities. They make available hundreds of different proposals and offers. The city is available for children and schools. And we saw another line of thought, which was that of an educational initiative throughout the system. I'm sure I've gone over my time limit, and I'll conclude here, but I just wanted to give you the practical idea, the practical organizational idea, which is this, basically. It's always the city as a political entity, and it requires all of the different components, the different city protagonists, as was the case for the school. It calls these people and it says, each and every one of you, because of your different skills and capacities, is responsible for creating conditions that enable the citizens throughout their entire lifetime to recognize, to understand, to participate. So it's a kind of strategic plan, if you like. It's a pact involving everybody. I don't think that the discourse was difficult. It's a pact involving everybody. Let's all agree that everybody will do their own bit. I can't give you examples now, but it's fascinating when you find out how many people took this idea on board and took initiatives. You can see the initiatives in a strategic plan, and it's amazing how many, on how many occasions the citizens were able to talk, find out, reflect, and remember that the problem of education, not only school education, but education as a whole, the number one problem in our society, and this is important, it's not just contents, and I'll conclude. When we say that things have changed compared to 20 years ago, well, I say they haven't really changed. They've evolved, they've transformed, particularly in terms of contents. But the method, that is the underlying thought, the frame, the discourse that I've tried to bring here using the simplest of words, well, that might have changed. And I'm saying that because obviously there are new technologies, we've got globalization, all kinds of new values, but these are contents that are added that make that method or that way of thinking and that working method even more necessary because there are new emerging problems. There's the crisis, of course. There's the transformation of production. Just look at Turin, which made a living from the automobile industry, from manufacturing industries. They've gone to Brazil and China now. They don't exist anymore. The 150,000 Fiat employees have been reduced by about 30% because, of course, there have been changes, but these changes, I don't think they mean that there's a crisis. I don't see that. Well, yes, it's clear that we could be talking here for 2 hours, and I know that you've made a huge sacrifice to condense everything into such a small format. But now it's the turn of Professor Del Pozo, based on the idea that contents change, circumstances change, but the function remains valid and important. How can you identify the new agents who are responsible for carrying out not only that educational function, but also the necessary adaptation? And what adaptation would that be?
La veritat és que és un gran repte intentar.
Well, it's quite a challenge, I have to say, to answer that. But I'm committed to trying to say what I can. It might seem very simplistic, but it's true. All of the agents, we're all the stakeholders in the process. And one of the biggest difficulties is the fact that responsibility appears to be delegated to others always. Is a constant interplay of passing the buck, one might say, giving responsibilities to others, institutions, parents, children, and so forth, as though there were fear of taking on board responsibilities because we're all subject to internationalization, globalization, which has an impact, as Bauman said, a state of global liquidity, one might say. I would say that the main demand would be having a noun connected with an adjective. Here we have educating and cities. And we have to remember that the noun is more important than the adjective for many people. But for some people, it's quite the opposite. Now, what we want now is a citizenship force of cities. If we're talking about educating cities, we can invoke a kind of prophetic idea of a Greek from centuries BC who said, Polis andride pasce, the city teaches men. And in fact, the cities do teach the people, it teaches the institutions, and creates a participatory dynamic in this, what we would call the agora. And that is where education comes from. If we can believe this idea in educating cities, and that is actually part of our essence. If we want to have cities with full-fledged citizenship, we will be having full-fledged education. What is from the scholastic standpoint, it can include formal education, but the mistake that we make in society is that all of the education takes place in the formal educational setting. In a increasingly globalized world, which carries everything away and everything's constantly changing, citizenship is the reference for the city. In a globalized world, cities can give citizens a minimum of stability in order to have a life with dignity, one with responsibility. I think there are some concepts that are very clear we don't have much time, but this morning in the keynote speech, we heard about the weakening of the public area, the fact that culture is becoming more liquid. And there was a book referred to this morning that referred to the loss of social cohesion, the weakening of public spaces, and more cultural liquidity, and the loss of social cohesion is a threat for personal. Want to say the construction of one's personal references, and citizenship and the effective education are also a part of this. And it's true that globalization has some positive effects, and I think we have to bear those in mind as well. Globalization has led to an acceleration of migration, which has increased cultural mixes in Catalonia and Spain, the rest of Spain. We've seen how our societies have gotten much better in terms of greater diversity and cultural richness, also in terms of communications. This is fundamental for human beings. Well, look how different is the way we communicate now and 15 years ago or earlier. The feeling of freedom that we have now, which is considered a right, this is obviously beneficial to us and to the process of citizenship and education. But going back again to the question of citizenship, I would just refer to a classical author, a Latin one, in this case not a Greek, and another who's contemporaneous, the Cicero. In the last part of his book, The Republic, this is considered the dream of Scipion, says something like this in favor of cities, that those who rule the world care nothing more for the world than groups of men and women united around a concept of law or of rights which is called cities. And this is what happens on Earth. People come around this sense of rights and law, which is rendered in the form of a city. And then we have a contemporary philosopher, German, who says it is a very decisive fact, which is never valued enough, that all great cultures are created around a city. Human beings are builders of cities. It's in their essence. And the whole process of rapid globalization makes cities the place where some stability can be created for citizens. And I would highlight the following characteristics with this connection with the educating city, which is the adjective as well as the noun. I would take the old-fashioned way of seeing citizenship as the Greeks said, the sum of education, culture, and an idea of beauty and goodness, which is kalligraphia. This was the basis of the education of Greek citizens. Of course, that we have to remember there were no women, no slaves included. But the ideal of the Greeks and of the beauty and goodness, and the Roman idea of law come together with the idea of inviolable individual dignity put forward by Kant, and coming into the 20th century to human rights, inviolable human rights. So we have different rights, beauty, individual rights, and social rights as well, which come together to create a sense of the city. And proper exercise of these aspects is, one would say, completely educational, because it's the way people grow to be who they are. If it's done in a proper way, naturally people will grow in a very positive way, and there will be an educational outcome. And I have 2 minutes left, so I would spend them, which is something important to me, and that is to say that to try to ward off the negative impact of globalization, it's important to think about cultural and social roots of our citizen, just as I mentioned a little bit earlier, and look from the educational and social standpoint at the essence of these people. And going back to what Dewey said, education and is the experience that you have when you're alive, and building up a real sense of citizenship. Well, the experience of that citizenship is in itself educational. It's like this hidden agenda or hidden curriculum, right? Because what we have is a lot that's under the surface, and that has an impact on people's education. And of course, that can also include building a city in a proper fashion. There's a bit of political philosophy from Pierre Rosanvallon, which is titled Democratic Legitimacy. It has to do with political action in favor of the city, including what we say in ethics is indispensable, with a major factor which is caring. How interesting. Of course, in ethics, we're concerned about caring. But what about in politics? And I think this is extraordinarily interesting. He says we have to consider as being complementary two dimensions of ethics, talking about fair rules on the one hand, and also determining behaviors in terms of attention. Just putting our attention on caring actually enhances the second aspect, which is almost minimized, which has to do with that ideal behavior. And just to conclude, and he's referring to Martin Nussbaum, a well-known humanist. Martin Nussbaum has acknowledged the philosophical contribution of literary works because they make it possible for us to understand things in a specific way, based on the complexity of characters and situations. And the philosopher Wittgenstein fought his entire life against what was referred to as the constant desire to generalize and the contempt for the particulars. The philosophers have based their focus on what we have right before us. So we've gone from ethics on those bases to politics. Before anything, we have to remember there is a huge social demand for a politics of caring, a policy of caring. So that involves a redefinition of democracy as a form of conduct. The ideal framework for carrying out this proposal, which is both ethical and political, bringing them both together, as Aristotle said, the ideal framework or the ideal setting is the city with a spirit of citizenship. Well, we can see that philosophy is it involves key concepts and frameworks. Angelica has experience as an educator and a philosopher, but also as a social activist and facilitator and a creative generator of different processes. And I think she can share many interesting ideas and suggestions, not just on the past and the present, but how educating cities should be in the future. I don't know if we can say 10 years, 5 years, or 2 months, because we don't even know what'll happen 2 months from now. What do you say?
Reto, eh?
Well, I can see a challenge. Good evening to all of you. Boa noite to the Brazilians who are here as well. Well, I'm going to give you 5 ideas in 15 minutes, 15 provocations, if you like. So we'll look at the other side of the coin. Let's see if we can look at the future of the educating cities. The first idea is that the educating city doesn't exist. you're going to say, well, what are we doing here then? The educating city is a utopia. The educating city is something that moves us, that places the desired city on the horizon, the city we want to achieve. The educating city, which is what all of you are and all of we are, is multiple attempts to transform or to make the utopia described in the Charter of Principles of the Educating City, to make it a reality. So that's the idea. The first idea is that the educating city doesn't exist. So based on that, how can we make the future? How can we make it exist? And as Gaetano Sitanaridri said, what's a utopia for? Well, utopia is for walking, for wanting to achieve it. So the educating city is there to make us want to really produce it. So I'd like to give you an analogy with diamonds. For me, educating cities are like diamonds. The diamond is the hardest mineral that exists. It's invincible. It can't be changed. It's brilliant, it's shiny, and when it's been well cut and well looked after, it's the most precious stone that exists. So the utopia of the educating city is to be invincible in its educating mission, unchangeable in its value and identity, valuable for all, desirable, desired by its inhabitants, and brilliant on the national and international stage. That's the utopia. And I'll just let you think about how we, all of the cities here present at this event, are going to shine. Idea number 2. How can we achieve that diamond utopian city? Well, everything starts with a look. Everything depends on how we look at things. The look that we need to focus on our city has to be an emancipating look, because depending on how we see our city, we act within it. We need to look in an emancipating manner. We need to really want to act. We want to be a part of the change, part of the construction. And that's the look that we need to stimulate and establish among our citizens and the governors of the cities. Now, I'm going to give you a question. What do you see when you look at your cities? How do you look at them? Do you look at them slowly, carefully, calmly, to enable hidden things to emerge from the corners? Or do we always look at our cities quickly as cities that are fast-moving and never stop? That emancipating look provokes action and calls for action, and that's the look at the city that will help us to build that diamond shining city. That questioning look enables us to find different possibilities, change perspectives, change the scale of things. Sometimes we have a problem that isn't that massive, but it occupies all of our mind. We can reduce it, we can make it smaller so that we can see other things on a larger scale. Well, each city is pregnant with numerous other cities. So how do we create that diamond city? We need to think about collective intelligence, social brains, that we really need to promote the intelligence of our cities when we create our educating cities. I'll give you another question now, because really the answers are within the shared problems. Idea number 3, be original, is going back to your origins. That's what Gaudí said, that fantastic architect, going back to nature, organic architecture. But what's the origin of the educating city? It's the human condition itself. The human condition is the urban condition. We are urban beings, and I'm not going to go on now because Mr. Juan Manuel del Pozo gave us a great idea about that in cities we are built as people, but we're also builders of those cities. Now, the huge, complex, globalized communication networks that we've talked about here are creating problems. The city is being invaded by the global, the local invaded by the global. So cities are tired of that hyperactive world. Therefore, in order to create our educating city, our brilliant diamond city, we need to overcome that urban problem. We need that Ubuntu ethic, the ethics of those villages in Africa, because we are, as a whole, for that educating city, we need contact. We need to meet. Creativity exists through contact between people, so that invasion of the global in the local, well, we can't allow that to happen. We need to overcome that. Idea number 4, invent the future based on on the excluded, the marginalized people. That event requires creativity, inclusion, participation, and sharing. And when we were thinking about these, I thought about the project. The project is a creative exercise based on the future, an organized action above and beyond the immediate. It's action with vision, with imagination. And therefore, we need to bear in mind the fact that we want to work thinking about the fact that the educating city is inclusive. So how do we create that educating city that doesn't exist, that diamond? We need to create based on exclusion. We need to think about the excluded people in our city as great creative potential for our city. Everything that doesn't work in the city is everything that we have to create. Isn't that marvelous? The non-places are there to be transformed into places. Excluded citizens are there to be included. Not included because we feel pity, but because there's wasted intelligence there. The social brain of a city requires everybody. And that look of the marginalized person, the invisible person, is a look on a city as a city that can shine like a diamond. Idea number 5. I hope that I'm sticking to my 15-minute time slot. It's quite a challenge, I can tell you. How do we build that educating city, that utopian diamond city? There are a number of possible answers to that, but I think we need to work on 2 things. 1, think about what we can do as public managers. Normally, what a public manager of a city does is seeks to organize social life, ensure that the city returns to normality. But I'm going to ask you, what is the normality of an educating city? Often, normality means going back to atopia, not that utopia that moves us and stimulates us to create the city, but atopia, that uncomfortable feeling among collectives and individuals, thinking about order. Sometimes going back to normality is going back to that uncomfortable feeling. So we need to face up to that. We need to transform, and that's the work of creativity in human life. We need to transform that uncomfortable feeling into well-being. We need to transform the city. Being an educating city is overcoming that disruption in the city, the unrest, and trying to build that desired city. the paradise in our day-to-day life as managers. I know it's hard. Every day we're up against problems that we need to overcome, but we shouldn't forget some principles that some creative people used in their work. For example, pursuing major projects such as Martin Luther King, who had his dream and he went right to the end, seeking a number of responses as Thomas Edison. To date, nobody has beaten him in terms of patents, but he made so many mistakes. He wasn't afraid of making mistakes. He took risks. He looked for a number of responses. He wasn't happy with the first one. Finding different responses like Gutenberg, seeking team responses like Disney, working with method like Agatha Christie, imagining the impossible like John Lennon did. Looking to the unknown as Christopher Columbus did. Sorry, I keep slipping into Portuguese. Well, in summary, how can we do this? Well, in day-to-day management of educating cities, we can make the ordinary become extraordinary, and we can persevere in spite of all of our failures, because there will be failures. Failure forms part of history. And we shouldn't at any time lose that passion to learn, because an educating city, when it is a true educating city, is passionate about learning, as are its citizens. And finally, and I'm concluding now, how do we ensure that utopia of an educating city that doesn't yet exist, how do we make it exist? Well, turning the words of the Charter with the principles, turning them into living words, making them live, making them come out of the bodies of the citizens, passing through the tissues of the streets in the cities. When that charter, with all the values that it contains, making it, when it becomes living, well, then the educating city will exist. It won't be a utopia any longer. So when the principles are so light, when we don't need to make an effort to implement them, when the principles are so light as air and as essential as air, well, then our city will become a diamond. It will shine. And I really want to be there when that happens, because I think that then we will see other utopias. Thank you.
Bueno, pues señores.
Ladies and gentlemen, long live utopia. It's taken us to great emancipation.
Que por cierto es una palabra que no.
Which indeed is not a very fashionable word. And in fact, it's the main problem of educating cities who understand educating as helping citizens become emancipated in all areas of their life. And I think this last speech has been extremely provocative, sufficiently so, so that many ideas have come to mind. But the main problem I see is that we want to be educators, but the framework in which we are working is increasingly adverse. We want to teach values. We want to teach sharing. We want to teach how to build social utopias in which we will all be better off. But there is a culture which trickles down from the business schools, and which individualism, extreme and cutthroat competition seems to be the norm. And this is then adapted as a setting in which to live. So this is becoming increasingly adverse. How do we deal with this increasingly adverse framework or setting?
No, non voglio ripetermi, ma se...
I don't want to repeat myself, but if difficulties increase, and I agree with what has been said here, although each and every one of us has talked more about our point of view and our experience. But basically, I share the principle. And if there are further difficulties, there will be further needs, because difficulties cause concern. Or they mean that you have to retreat or leave the field. But I think that the opposite is happening. Precisely what you were saying. We have so many forces, and that concept of educating city sets out the social group. There are those who are in favor of the educating city and those who are against it. Perhaps, I don't know. But of course, we're in favor of it. That's why the association exists, to bring people in favor together, and so that they can find strength through cooperation and unity and events like this in order to resist attacks by those who don't believe in such ideas. That's always happened. I just wanted to make two observations. I really agree that the educating city doesn't have to exist. That's not a prerequisite. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that it's seen as an objective, as a plan, a project. And that beautiful Spanish word, an ilusión. I don't know if I've actually understood that word, that Spanish word, properly, because I don't think it's the same as the Italian illusion, which is to create something that's not possible. I've never studied Spanish, but that word ilusión is a positive word. It has more to do with enthusiasm and passion, and that's the educating city. The enemy of the educating city is the person who says, well, where is that educating city? It doesn't exist. It's impossible. It's a utopia. It's a way of wasting time. We've heard that often, particularly from politicians. It's a Rousseau idea based on the principle that men are good, that children are naturally happy. So those are the enemies of the educating city, the skeptics. And that's where Thanatos beats Eros. Those in favor of the educating city, and luckily they exist, are the people who think that Eros beats Taros. I don't want to take anything away from the philosopher here, but current experience. I've been the president of the art academy in our city. It's a university service, but the organization and the governance are autonomous. So every music conservatory and art academy has its own president. Normally, universities don't need presidents, but this is the case here. And as was recalled, as the importance of creativity was recalled previously, you said, what's the raw material that's necessary to move towards the educating city? Well, it's being able to imagine something different, creativity, that capacity, that pleasure in thinking of something different. Everyone talks about innovation. Everyone says, oh, well, innovation is what will get us out of the crisis because it's not a temporary crisis. It's a structural crisis, at least in the West. And I've heard politicians and philosophers say, well, since it's structural and it's not temporary, the only way of getting out of it is to have the courage to think of different things. And I live among 1,500 young people, including some 400 Chinese people studying at the academy. And there are the thousands of Chinese people who come to Italian academies. They've been sent, well, okay, they've made that choice, that life choice, precisely because they say, well, in China, creativity is extremely difficult. Nevertheless, it's necessary. So let's go and learn from the most creative countries in the world, particularly those academies that teach that centuries-old tradition of the arts. So I'm experiencing this kind of thing, and I just wanted to confirm the fact that indeed there is that need, that political need for creativity. And I talk about it continually with my students, because why are the students at the academy? Well, because first they studied arts. They were born like that. Because at that time, particularly in Italy, if there weren't that natural force, that natural tendency, well, people wouldn't study arts. In fact, when people say to their parents, I want to go to the art academy, the family gets really worried. They despair. But I was talking about China and the students who come to Italy to release their creativity. And I'm happy that even here today, dignity has been given to creativity and to those 1,000 or so young people who accept the dangers and the uncertainty of the future, to hang on to that idea. It doesn't apply only to art, but to society as a whole.
Okay.
Angélica había pedido.
No.
Just now, you, please. Angelica.
Interrumpir cuando queráis.
You know, you can just raise your hand if you want to butt in. I just had a couple things to mention. The educating city does not exist. It is a utopia, but I think it would be great if it did exist, because it's important to have it as a project, a goal. But I'm sure once we get there, there'll be more projects, further projects, and we can go still further. I would never like to give the idea that it can exist only as a project. It has to be brought into reality, because once it exists, then there other utopias will appear as a result. And the other thing I wanted to say was to go back to what you said about the dignity of creativity, or at least what I understand creativity to be. Naturally, art cannot exist without the capacity of humans to create, but this does not exist only in the artistic area. One of the great efforts and important efforts of educating cities is to create a creative citizenship, that emancipating regard of the citizens is very important for the cities, because they can think in a creative way. They can think out of the box. They can find solutions. And this is a way of making the creative capacity of the citizens at large something that's considered worthwhile. It goes beyond just creative principles, because the most important creativity is one in which we can work on and stimulate in citizens at large to make our city as more pleasant, more better places to live in, let's say. I'm convinced of what you said, and I'm going to try to be a bit creative and add another word to these 4 words, which are also really great, because I think it is implicit, and it's the only word that was missing from what you said, which is commitment. Well, some years ago, some decades ago, it was very important, and in our globalized culture, it seems to have lost its power. But without commitment, we won't go anywhere, because as Juan Carlos Tedesco, an Argentinian we know well, when talking about the educating city, he said schools are counter-cultural. And I was a bit shocked because I was imagining punky teachers with earrings and green hair. But he said schools run against some of the cultural and educational values which are fundamental to us. When school there's a constant attack against some of the cultures we think most fundamental to humans. So we would like a commitment with the idea of education. Mr. Alfieri said the greater the difficulties, the greater the need. We can't just throw up our hands and say we can't do anything about this, because we would poor citizens and poor educators. We cannot throw in the towel when we encounter difficulties. So we have objective difficulties. It's a globalized world which is anti-educational more than anything else. So we have to call for an educational role of cities and schools. This means we need a strengthening of the underlying agenda of school, which is fostering citizenship in cities, because that is a place where people live. And I go back to care and in considering individuals. But if we don't have a commitment of people to work together, we'll be overcome by individualism. There is one difficulty, however, and that is the trap of language. There are times when words have been taken by people who are against those words. For example, we're talking about commitment. It's obvious that in educating city, as was said in the keynote speech, one thing that's very important is participation. But we've all seen how the concept of participation has been deteriorated until it's become something of a pantomime or a simulation. And they assign the role of participation to others. Another one is belonging. So what do we do when we're in a world, and we women have seen this very clearly, feminism has become a household word. Laws have been enacted, and cities have been consider themselves places of equality with gender equality, and yet inequalities continue to exist. So where are the instruments that will make this transformation possible? Because if we are going to, there's a way of dealing with this supposed utopia by giving it a content. I would say that right now, what I would like to see in the city as a whole, as a major source of education, well, what I would like to see is the school as the ideal space to work on language in a much more intense and richer way than what is done now. Because it's true that language, with language go a whole series of different areas of interest, political, cultural, economic, and so forth. And we've been victims in this regard. As Wittgenstein said, most philosophical and human problems in general need not be resolved. They need to be dissolved. If you look linguistically at the construction of the problem, you realize that the precision of different words and the discourse, if they were properly approached or formulated, they would cease to exist. So for children, boys and girls, we have to give them the linguistic capacity, the language capacity, so that conceptually they can perceive the traps that are being put forward for us in the area of language.
Que a la escuela
I'm clear. Well, I agree with Jose Manuel. I'm clear that schools have a fundamental role to play in terms of reflexive education, critical and creative education, careful education, and it's up to us, those of us working in schools, but that's also up to those in the city. The city has to be a space that stimulates within and outside school the intelligence of people. It has to stimulate their capacity to talk, to think, to really think above and beyond the immediacy of problems, to think about possible consequences to actions, to be reasonable inside and outside school. So that's what I think we have to try to do. We need to really look at the other side of things. I love that Spanish expression, to flip the omelette over. But the city's mechanisms, isolation, exclusion, those very mechanisms can be transformed, can be turned over to become mechanisms for dialogue, for thought. Paulo Freire said that humans become human through dialogue. That ability to think, we need to work together with others. And it's up to all of us. We have to do that when we're on the bus, at the metro, in parks, in city squares. We need to stimulate thought. Recently, with everything that we were talking about previously, well, we're becoming like Cephalus. The machines do everything for us. We don't need to think, and that's not good. Cities need to stimulate that ability to think, to make people want to think and participate. That is what collective intelligence of that social brain is, that contact, meeting. Well, perhaps I'm influenced by my experience. I've worked for 50 years, half in school and half in cities, in administration. So it's hard for me to not give importance to both sides, education and politics, administrative politics, of course, not well, basically the politics governing life. That's essential. You talked about the tools required to contrast and compare certain forms of generation, but I think that they're the two important, essential tools. On the one hand, school, on the other, the authorities, because to date, we haven't spoken about democracy. Democracy is no longer in fashion. But a few days ago in this city, space was given to democracy, to individual choice. Let's not exclude that totally, because sometimes political choices are made and those in charge should be asked to be involved in such processes. Perhaps I wasn't clear, I said it at the start, but an important component, well, because if we think that the educating city comes out spontaneously, well, yes, it is a utopia. We need techniques like schools. We don't live educational, we don't experience educational tension. there should be tension in school and in the city. So what I sought to say at the beginning was that there's a possibility. I live in a city that has had that experience and continues to have it. There is that possibility of, since we're delegates of that democratic process, as administrators, how can I say that? We need to take the initiative. I repeat, we need all the different components of the system to think. That we can't just get lost in it. There's this complexity that can be reduced. We can identify the various components, and we can involve all of them. It's in everybody's interest that citizens receive information, and information doesn't mean that they need to be conditioned, because conditioning doesn't lead to education. Like a Greek theatre, it's not propaganda on the values that have to be conveyed, because the most beautiful tragedies of Euripides and Sophocles are open tragedies. They don't tell you who was right, if it was Antigone or not. With my grandchildren, 2 years ago, they were 16 and 13, and we went to Syracuse, and we spent 3 evenings at the Greek theatre. And the thing that most impressed them was to see that today, 12,000 people at every evening event left Antigone, and they spent all evening and the next day, they spent the time at the restaurant asking whether Antigone was right or whether Creontes was right. And my grandchildren, my 16-year-old grandchild, understood that the Greek theatre is the son of democracy, if you like. So we need this theatre. The theatre has to be beautiful. It has to be enhanced. The tragedy has to begin upstream. Then it gets dark and there's fire. There has to be a climate. Unfortunately, there isn't often that climate at school, that climate of passion. And then, right then, we strike. But how do we strike? With propaganda? With the lesson, or with the theatre? Something that goes to the heart of it, because it's creative. And then with theatre, people go and see it. It's something that wants to make people think, and when they leave, it wants to make people leave the theatre with a doubt. So, I think that's the work that a city needs to continue to do, the school and the city. It needs to ensure that the different components are called to take responsibility, and each has to contribute. I can't give you examples now, but luckily the city I live in is constantly offering opportunities to its citizens to understand and learn. And as I was saying, understanding doesn't mean, and I'll close with what Brunner said, understanding is the crossroads between epistemology and ethics, that is, knowledge and ethics. That's the goal. It's very refined, but that's the objective. The educating city is a city in which people have many opportunities to understand. I'm sorry we've run out of time. I'm getting told off by the organizers. Just a few concepts to conclude. Thank you very much for being here and for taking advantage of the little time available. I wanted to quote Marina Garcés, a philosopher, who asks us to think about why so many reactionary movements that have existed in the past. They share stop, slow. Why are all these words stop and slow down? Because the difficulty of making critical citizens, free thinkers, people who can really build a utopia, it's harder than ever before. And therefore, since the difficulty is increasing, I'd like to pick up on what the panel said. There's an increased need for educating cities. But in order to have educating cities, as Professor Del Pozo said, we need institutions, we need people, we need bodies, we need schools, the entire social fabric to commit to stimulate thought. We have a great gap, a shortcoming in thought. So long live utopia, long live thought. Thank you very much.
Impatto. Non mi pare ci sia altra soluzione.